"You'll want to sit somewhere else," the Velkari cadet said, and she said it the way you'd warn someone about a damp chair, polite, disinterested, already moving on. "That station feeds the cognitive array directly. Non-shielded species lose about 4 minutes of short-term memory per session, sometimes 5. Nessa Calloway looked at the station. It was identical to the other 47 in the circular chamber. A reclined seat of smooth white composite, a curved headrest with 6 contact points glowing faint blue, and a console screen showing her name, her cohort number, and the words neural assessment, pending in clean silver type. She looked back at the Velkari, a tall, narrow-shouldered figure with lavender skin, and 4 pupils that tracked independently like a chameleon designed by a committee, and shrugged. "I'll manage," she said. The Velkari blinked 2 of her 4 eyes in a pattern Nessa would later learn meant something close to your funeral, and walked away. That was the first morning at the Keris Analytical Institute, and it was the last time anyone tried to help Nessa Calloway without being asked. The Keris Institute sat in orbit above a moon called Eshera, a tidally locked rock whose sunlit face was a sheet of white quartz, and whose dark side held a cold deep enough to freeze starlight, if starlight had mass. The institute itself was beautiful in the way that expensive hospitals are beautiful. Every surface curved, every material polished, every light source tuned to a color temperature that communicated competence and calm simultaneously. It trained cognitive analysts, the specialists who interpreted neural mapping data, assessed threat cognition profiles, diagnosed species-specific cognitive drift, and in wartime cracked enemy command psychologies by reading their decision architectures from captured neural impressions. Nessa was 17. She had arrived on a Terran Alliance scholarship that covered tuition but not respect, and her orientation packet had included a single sheet of species-specific advisories for human students. The sheet was 3 lines long. Line 1. Human neural tissue is unshielded and will interact unpredictably with standard cognitive interface equipment. Line 2. Terran students are advised to request analog alternatives where available. Line 3. The Institute assumes no liability for cognitive discomfort experienced during standard assessment protocols. 3 lines. The Korvathi students got 11 pages, the Velkari got 8. Nessa had read the 3 lines, folded the sheet, and put it in the pocket of her gray institute-issued jumpsuit, where it stayed for the next 9 months. The cohort was 48 cadets drawn from 19 species. Nessa was the only human. This was not unusual. The Keris Institute had admitted exactly 14 humans in its 90-year operational history, and 7 of those had withdrawn before completing the second assessment cycle. The other 7 had graduated with restricted certifications that limited them to support roles, data cleaning, pattern preprocessing, archival indexing. No human had ever earned an unrestricted cognitive analyst certification. The Institute's own projections, updated annually by the administrative AI called the Tesseract, placed the probability of a human completing the full program at 6%. The probability of unrestricted certification was listed as statistically negligible, which was the Tesseract's way of saying 0 without committing to the word. Nessa knew this. She had read the statistics before she applied, the way you read weather reports before a hike, useful, noted, not sufficient reason to stay home. The first assessment cycle began on day 3. The Keris Institute did not teach the way most academies taught. There were no lectures, no textbooks, no instructors standing at the front of a room explaining principles. The Institute's entire pedagogy was built around direct cognitive interface. You sat in the assessment station, the array connected to your neural tissue through the 6 contact points on the headrest, and you experienced the material, not read it, not heard it. Experienced it, raw cognitive data fed directly into your processing architecture, and your brain either organized it or it didn't. For shielded species, the Corvathi with their segmented cortical buffers, the Velkari with their quad-partitioned neural mesh, the Torvani with their resonance dampeners. The interface was a tool. Clean, calibrated, efficient. Data in, structure out, assessment scored. For humans, it was an open window in a hurricane. Nessa sat in the station on day 3, felt the contacts engage, and for approximately 9 seconds experienced what she would later describe to nobody as having her skull turned inside out and used as a bowl. The cognitive data, a Pelori merchant's decision architecture during a trade dispute, mapped in full 3-dimensional neural topology, arrived in her unshielded brain like a fire hose aimed at a teacup. There was no buffer, no filter, no partition between the incoming data and her own neural processes. The Pelori's anxiety became her anxiety. The Pelori's spatial reasoning overlaid her own, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't tell which set of hands were hers. The emotional substrate of the merchant's memories, frustration, calculation, the particular flavor of Pelori loneliness that sat in the frontal cluster like a cold stone, settled into her awareness with the unwelcome intimacy of a stranger's dream. She gripped the armrests, her jaw locked, 9 seconds. Then her brain did what human brains do when overwhelmed. It adapted. Not gracefully, not completely, not in any way the Institute's calibration protocols would recognize as structured processing. But the chaos organized itself into something she could hold, the way your eyes adjust to darkness, not by seeing better, but by learning to use what little light exists. She scored 34 out of 100. The cohort average was 71. The Velkari who had warned her about the station scored 89 and didn't look in Nessa's direction when the results were posted. Nobody did. A 34 was not a score that invited attention. It was a score that confirmed a prediction, and confirmed predictions are boring. Nessa looked at the number on the display board for the length of time it took to memorize it, then walked to the refectory, ate a meal she didn't taste, went back to her quarters, and sat on the edge of her sleeping rack thinking about what had happened inside the station. Not the score. The 9 seconds. She thought about the moment when the Pelori's decision architecture had overlapped with hers, and how, just before her brain clamped down and started sorting, she had understood the merchant's reasoning not as data but as experience. She hadn't analyzed the trade dispute. She had been inside it. She had felt the merchant weigh his options the way you feel your own hand weigh a stone, directly, proprioceptively, without translation. That wasn't in the curriculum. The Institute's method was analysis. Receive data, structure it, extract patterns, score the architecture. What Nessa had done briefly, chaotically, and at a cost of the worst headache of her young life was something else entirely. She didn't have a name for it yet. She would eventually. She did have a headache. It lasted 7 hours and sat behind her eyes like a fist that had closed and forgotten how to open. She took the analgesic the medical station dispensed, a Corvathi formulation that the intake nurse had warned might cause mild disorientation in humans, and lay in the dark of her quarters listening to the station's climate systems, cycling through their nighttime cadence and waiting for the pain to recede. When it finally did, somewhere around midnight, she sat up and opened the notebook her mother had pressed into her hands at the shuttle terminal on Earth 3 weeks and 1 wormhole transit ago and wrote, Assessment 1, scored 34/100, headache 7 HR, felt the merchant's loneliness, still feeling it. Then she put the pen down, because there was nothing else to write that would make the number on the display board any different, and went to sleep. The second assessment came on day 8. A Torvani fleet commander's neural map during a skirmish, faster data, more emotional noise, 3 competing decision threads tangled like wet rope. Nessa braced herself, felt the contacts engage, and this time lasted 14 seconds before her brain started sorting. She scored 38. Better, but better at the bottom is still the bottom. The Tesseract's projection for her final certification probability dropped from 6% to 4%. This adjustment was automatic, algorithmic, and posted to the cohort display with the same dispassionate efficiency as everyone else's trajectory. Nessa's line on the projection graph bent downward like a road, heading for a valley with no visible exit. The proctor for their cohort was not a person but an aspect of the tesseract itself, a localized processing node that manifested as a silver-blue holographic column in the center of the assessment chamber. It didn't have a face, a name, or a personality. It had a voice, neutral and precise, and it addressed each cadet by number and species designation. Nessa was Cadet 31, Terran. After the second assessment, the tesseract's column brightened slightly, its version of turning to face her, and spoke. Cadet 31, your performance trajectory indicates a cumulative deficit that will exceed recoverable parameters by assessment cycle 4. Standard advisement is to consider voluntary withdrawal before accruing a non-recoverable academic record. Around the chamber, 17 cadets who had been pretending not to listen stopped pretending. Nessa looked at the column. Is that a recommendation or a requirement? An advisement. Withdrawal remains voluntary at all stages. However, the statistical outcome for Terran cadets who continue past Cycle 4 with sub-threshold trajectories is a 0% certification rate. 0, Nessa repeated. Correct. She nodded once, the way you nod at a weather report that says rain. Noted. She stayed. That evening, the Tesseract posted the updated cohort projections to the public display, the same wall-mounted screen that showed every cadet's trajectory as a color-coded line graph trending toward or away from certification. Nessa's line, which had started at 6% and dropped to 4%, now carried a small annotation in Corvathi script that she asked her console to translate. The translation came back as, subject advised of sub-threshold trajectory, elected to continue. No further advisory will be issued. It was the institutional equivalent of washing your hands. The Tesseract had done its due diligence. Whatever happened next was on the record as Nessa's choice, not the Institute's responsibility. She looked at the annotation for a long time and then went to bed. Between cycles, the Institute's residential wing operated on its own quiet rhythms. The Corvathi cadets occupied the upper ring and communicated in subvocal frequencies. Their segmented throats produced sounds below human hearing that Nessa felt as a faint vibration in the walls when she walked past their section. The Velkari kept to their own corridor, their four-pupil conversations carrying data Nessa couldn't decode in the flicker of irises contracting and expanding like tiny apertures adjusting to light. The Pelori slept in salt mist chambers that leaked a mineral tang into the recycled air, and the Dacic occupied the silence the way they occupied everything, completely, without apology. Nessa ate alone, studied alone, ran the corridors each morning alone because running required no translation and no interface, just her body and the artificial gravity and the steady sound of her own breathing, which was hers and nobody else's. 3 laps of the residential ring, 4 kilometers total, and by the end of the second week she noticed that a Velkari cadet had started running the same route 20 meters behind, matching her pace without overtaking. Nessa didn't turn around. She noted it, data point filed, no immediate action required. The third assessment came on day 12. A Pelori diplomat's neural map during interspecies negotiations. 6 simultaneous relationship threads maintained in parallel, each requiring a different social register, each carrying its own emotional valence. The Corvathi cadets scored in the mid-70s. Their segmented processing handled the threads efficiently, but missed the emotional cross-contamination. The way the diplomat's anxiety about Thread 3 bled into her tone during Thread 5, a leakage that changed the meaning of everything she said in that register. Nessa scored 41, still failing, but the headache lasted only 90 minutes, and when she reviewed her work against the scoring key, she found that she'd correctly identified the cross-contamination effect, named it, described the mechanism. The Institute's scoring algorithm hadn't given her credit because cross-contamination detection wasn't in the assessment criteria. It wasn't supposed to be detectable through the standard methodology at all. She wrote in her notebook that night, "They're measuring the wrong thing," or "I'm doing the wrong thing," or "there's a thing neither of us has a name for yet." Assessment 4 was another archival map, a Korvathi engineer's problem-solving sequence during a station repair. Straightforward, linear, playing to algorithmic strengths. Nessa scored 47. The Tesseract's projection dropped to 3%, but the 47 included a notation she'd added, a description of the engineer's emotional state that the archival map wasn't supposed to contain because it had been scrubbed before storage. Nessa had detected it anyway, in the micro-patterns of the decision tree's timing, slight hesitations between steps that weren't procedural caution, but the cognitive signature of a person working through grief while maintaining professional function. The Tesseract did not score the notation. It did flag it for institutional review. The third assessment cycle introduced live subjects. Until now, all cognitive data had been archival, recorded neural maps played back through the interface. Clean, static, predictable. Live subjects were different. A living mind was not a recording. It moved. It reacted to being observed. It had defenses, conscious and unconscious, that archival maps didn't possess, and the act of interfacing with a live subject was less like reading a book and more like having a conversation with someone who didn't want to talk to you. The subject for Assessment 5 was a Dasyc diplomat. Dasyc were silence-based communicators. Their cognitive architecture used negative space the way most species used signal, and reading a Dasyc mind was like trying to hear a conversation conducted entirely in pauses. The assessment task: identify the diplomat's primary negotiating position from a 60-second live interface. The Korvathi cadets handled it with algorithmic precision, shielded cortices sampling patterns, mapping silence architecture, extracting positions in clean structured output. Average time to assessment, 31 seconds. Average accuracy, 82%. Nessa sat in the station. The contacts engaged. The Dasyc's mind opened like a dark room. And Nessa fell in. She didn't mean to. The Institute's method demanded analytical distance, observe the architecture, map it, extract data. But Nessa's unshielded brain didn't have analytical distance. When the Dasyc's mind opened, hers went with it, like a door swinging into a room she hadn't known existed. The silence wasn't absence. It was full, packed with meaning her analytical framework couldn't categorize, but her nervous system recognized instantly. The diplomat wasn't hiding his position. He was expressing it in a language Nessa's conscious mind couldn't parse, but her body understood the way you understand the tone of a voice before the words register, not as information, but as orientation. She came out of the interface 44 seconds later and wrote down the diplomat's primary negotiating position, his secondary fallback, his emotional disposition toward the opposing delegation, and the specific cognitive trigger that would cause him to abandon negotiation entirely. A detail the assessment hadn't asked for, and the Korvathi cadets hadn't detected, because it lived in a register their shielded cortices filtered out as noise. She scored 91. The chamber went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a sound system fails, not silence, but the sudden absence of expected noise. The Velkari from day one turned her head slowly, 4 pupils converging on a single point. The Tesseract's holographic column brightened and held the brighter state for 3 full seconds, the longest Nessa had ever seen it sustain any kind of response. "Cadet 31, the Tesseract said, "your assessment score exceeds the cohort mean by 19 points. This represents a deviation of 4 standard deviations from your projected trajectory." "Yes," Nessa said. "The assessment methodology used does not correspond to any recognized analytical framework in the Institute's pedagogical library." Nessa looked at the silver-blue column. Is that a problem? It is an observation. Your methodology will be flagged for review. Noted. She didn't explain what she'd done. She wasn't sure she could have, not in terms the Tesseract would accept. What she'd done was stop trying to analyze and start trying to listen, not to the data, but to the person inside the data. She'd stopped treating the Dasic's mind as a puzzle to be solved and started treating it as a place to be visited. The Institute trained analysts. Nessa, without meaning to, had become something closer to an interpreter. The fourth assessment cycle proved it wasn't a fluke. Assessment 6. A Rithani Colony Administrator's Crisis Decision Architecture. The Rithani communicated through resonance, layered harmonic patterns that carried meaning in their interference frequencies. Shielded species parsed resonance data as waveform analysis, converting harmonics to visual patterns on their console screens. Nessa's unshielded brain received it raw, as music she couldn't unhear, and the administrator's crisis decisions played through her awareness like a symphony whose structure told the story of a mind trying to save 800 people on a dying station while the air recyclers failed section by section. She scored 87. She also cried for 4 minutes afterward in the corridor outside the chamber, which she would have preferred no one witnessed. But the Velkari, whose name was Thessa, and who had been running 20 meters behind Nessa for 3 weeks without a word, was coming from the opposite direction and saw. Thessa didn't comment. She slowed her pace, flicked 2 of her 4 eyes toward Nessa in a pattern that carried no judgment, and continued walking. It was the Velkari equivalent of handing someone a handkerchief, without requiring them to acknowledge they needed one. Assessment 7. A Korvathi Military Strategist's Battle Planning Architecture. This one was designed to favor Korvathi cadets, their own species, their own cognitive patterns, their own decision trees organized in the segmented, parallel, four-armed precision that their biology was built for. Nessa scored 83 against a Korvathi cohort average of 88, 5 points below the species advantage average. The Tesseract flagged it as anomalous, not because the score was high for a human, but because no human had ever scored within 10 points of the Korvathi average on a Korvathi native assessment in the Institute's entire operational history. Assessment 8 was a compound assessment, 3 subjects in sequence, increasing complexity, 60 seconds each. A Velkari artist experiencing creative crisis, her 4-partitioned mind throwing interference patterns between partitions like a room of mirrors, shattering one at a time. A Torvani engineer debugging a reactor under time pressure, his mind a dense lattice of mechanical logic threaded with the specific breed of anxiety that engineers feel when the numbers stop obeying the rules. And a human, the first human neural map in the Institute's archive, a field medic making triage decisions during a station evacuation. Nessa scored 79 on the Velkari, 84 on the Torvani, and 96 on the human. The 96 broke the assessment record, not the human record. The all-species, all-time assessment record. No cadet of any species in 90 years had scored above 94 on a triage decision architecture. The Tesseract displayed the score without commentary, but the Korvathi cadet who had been leading the cohort since day 1 turned in her seat and looked at Nessa with 3 unblinking eyes and an expression that was impossible to misinterpret. She was recalculating. Assessment 9 introduced cross-species compound reads, 3 neural architectures presented simultaneously, layered in the interface the way a real analyst encounters them during multi-party negotiations, where understanding 3 command perspectives at once is the difference between preventing a war and starting one. The Korvathi partitioned the 3 feeds into separate analytical streams. Nessa received all 3 at once into the same unshielded space. A Rithani merchant, a Pelori navigator, a Torvani diplomat, 3 minds layered like 3 songs playing simultaneously, their harmonics clashing, their cadences conflicting. For 8 seconds, she couldn't find herself in the noise. Then her brain synthesized. It found the intersections where all three minds processed the same external variable from different cognitive frameworks and used those intersections as anchors. The result wasn't 3 analyses but a single integrated understanding, agreement points, incompatibilities, and the specific concession sequence that would bring consensus. She scored 89 and produced an analysis the rubric didn't have a category for. After the session, the Tesseract requested a private interface. The chamber was empty, 47 seats dark, the holographic column brightened. Cadet 31, your performance across assessments 5 through 9 demonstrates a methodology the Institute cannot categorize within existing analytical frameworks. I know. You are not performing the same task as your cohort. Your cohort analyzes cognitive architecture. You appear to inhabit it. She thought about that. Is that a problem? The unrestricted examination assesses analytical capability. If your methodology is not analytical, the examination may not measure what you actually do. Then what does it measure? Competence in the methodology the Institute teaches. And if there's a methodology the Institute doesn't teach that produces better results. 2 full seconds of silence, cycles enough to recalculate a moon's orbital decay. That question falls outside my advisory parameters. Noted, she stood. Update my projection. Certification, 61%, unrestricted, 14%. From statistically negligible. Correct. She walked out. A Corvathi cadet named Varen, Station 4, consistently ranked in the top 5, intercepted her in the corridor the following morning. Cadet 31, your Assessment 9 score included unauthorized analytical categories. The assessment doesn't prohibit additional categories. It scores the required ones. The required categories are the categories. Apparently not. His upper eye narrowed, the Corvathi equivalent of a jaw tightening. The Institute's methodology has produced 90 years of certified analysts. Your methodology has produced one uncertified human who scores below threshold on standard assessments and above threshold on assessments requiring abandonment of the standard methodology. That is not innovation. It is inconsistency. Tesseract looked at him. She could feel, faintly, the residual architecture of the Rithani merchant from the compound read, the habit of assessing an opponent's flexibility before responding. She pushed the residual aside. This was hers to answer. You're right, she said. It is inconsistent. He paused. Agreement had wrong-footed him. I'm learning 2 things at once, your methodology and whatever mine turns out to be. I'm bad at yours. I might be good at mine. The Institute will have to decide which one it wants to certify. His 3 eyes held their configuration for 2 more seconds, then shifted into something she couldn't read, not hostility, not respect, but a recalibration of some internal model that had been adjusted and not yet settled. He walked away without another word. Assessment 13 was an archival Velkari diplomat. A mind Nessa had expected to be familiar after months of watching Thessa's pupil patterns across the refectory table, but which turned out to be something entirely different from what she'd anticipated. The diplomat's cognitive architecture was organized in 4 parallel streams, the standard Velkari quadpartition. But unlike the shielded, neatly separated partitions the Institute's methodology assumed, this diplomat's partitions were deliberately porous. She had cultivated cross-partition communication as a diplomatic tool, allowing emotional data from one conversation to inform strategic calculations in another, using the interference as a source of insight rather than treating it as noise to be filtered out. Nessa recognized the strategy instantly because it was a refined version of what her own unshielded brain did by default. The diplomat had built, through decades of practice, what Nessa had been born without the walls to prevent. The score 90 was almost secondary to the revelation. She sat in the corridor afterward, notebook open, and wrote, "She does it on purpose. What I do by accident. The difference is that she can turn it off. I can't." Then, underneath, "Yet." The fifth and sixth assessment cycles are where the vignettes compress. Not because the assessments were forgettable, but because mastery has a rhythm, and once the rhythm establishes itself, it becomes the background against which the costs stand out. She scored consistently in the high 80s, occasionally broke 90. The headaches persisted, dull pressure behind her eyes lasting 2 to 4 hours after every interface session. Twice, she lost fragments of the previous day's memories, gaps she caught only because her personal log entries didn't match her recollections the following morning. She started keeping a backup log, handwritten, in a small physical notebook she'd brought from Earth. Her mother had pressed it into her hands at the shuttle terminal and said, "Write it down so you always know what's yours." The habit drew puzzled glances from cadets who hadn't seen physical writing implements since their homeworld museums. The notebook became a tether. After every assessment, she wrote 3 things: what she'd felt, what she'd learned, and what it had cost. The felt column grew longer and more specific. She developed a private vocabulary for the textures of alien cognition, the way a sommelier develops words for 2 wines that look identical in the glass. The learned column grew shorter, distilling toward principles she was still learning to articulate. The cost column stayed consistent: headache duration, memory fragments count, emotional residue type and intensity. The emotional residue was the part nobody had warned her about. When you inhabit another mind, not analyze it through a shielded cortex at safe analytical distance, but inhabit it the way you inhabit a room, fully present, breathing its air, you bring pieces back. Not thoughts exactly, more like weather. After the Rithani administrator, Nessa spent 2 days hearing phantom harmonics in quiet rooms, the echo of resonance patterns that existed only in her memory but felt as real as the climate system's hum through the station walls. After the Dacic diplomat, she found herself pausing mid-sentence, leaving silences where words should have been, because the diplomat's communication architecture had left grooves in her own processing that her native patterns kept falling into like wheels into ruts. After the human field medic, she woke at 3 in the morning with her hands making triage gestures she'd never learned, sorting invisible patients by severity with a precision that belonged to someone else's muscle memory entirely. She didn't report these residuals. The advisory sheet had 3 lines. None of them covered this. But the cost was real, and it accumulated the way interest accumulates. Invisibly, steadily, the mathematics of it indifferent to whether you were paying attention. And Nessa was 17 and smart enough to know that intelligence wasn't the same as wisdom, and young enough to believe that knowing the difference was sufficient protection against the gap. It wasn't. Assessment 14 was a Rithani warlord. The Institute had rules about assessment subjects. All neural maps were anonymized. All live subjects were volunteers. All data was scrubbed of identifying markers that might bias interpretation. But the rules didn't account for what happened when the analyst's methodology bypassed the anonymization layer entirely. When instead of reading the label on the door, you walked through it and found the person standing on the other side with everything they'd ever done written in the architecture of their mind. Nessa sat in the station, the contacts engaged, the warlord's mind opened. And Nessa learned, in the space of 11 seconds, what it felt like to order the deaths of 4,000 civilians for a strategic calculation she could follow step by step with the cold clarity of someone who had built the reasoning herself. The warlord's cognitive architecture was pristine, no doubt, no guilt, no tremor in the decision tree. The order was optimal. The math checked out. The 4,000 were an acceptable variable in a system that produced a net positive outcome for Rithani territorial expansion, and the warlord's mind held this knowledge the way a bridge holds weight. Structurally, without strain, without awareness that holding was a choice, rather than a fact of engineering. Nessa came out of the interface and threw up in the corridor. Her hands were shaking. Her vision had gone gray at the edges, the peripheral world dimming the way it dims before you faint. The headache was already building, but it was secondary to something worse, the absolute certainty that the warlord's reasoning had made sense, not morally, logically. And for 11 seconds, Nessa had agreed with it, not because she believed it, but because she had been inside a mind that did, and the boundary between her own assessment and the warlord's had dissolved entirely. And for those seconds, she hadn't been able to find the seam between what she thought and what she'd been shown. She scored 94 on the assessment, the highest in the cohort by 11 points. She sat in her quarters that night with the notebook open and couldn't write anything in the felt column, because the words wouldn't organize themselves into sentences that were hers alone. What she'd felt was someone else's certainty wearing her nervous system like a borrowed coat, and the coat had fit without alteration, and that was the thing she couldn't stop turning over in her mind. She went to the assessment chamber at midnight, alone, and stood in front of the Tesseract's column in the empty dark. "I need to ask you something." The column brightened. "Proceed, Cadet 31. The methodology I use, the inhabiting, is there a risk of permanent cognitive contamination?" 2 seconds of silence. "Define contamination." "Retaining decision architectures from assessed subject that override or alter my own native patterns." 4 seconds, the longest pause Nessa had experienced from the Tesseract outside of a system-level query. The Institute's data on unshielded cognitive interfacing is limited. 14 human subjects across 90 years is an insufficient sample for longitudinal analysis. However, the theoretical risk is non-zero. Repeated immersion in foreign cognitive architectures without structural shielding could result in progressive blurring of the analyst's native decision patterns. Could result. The probability is unquantifiable with current data. The advisory recommendation would be to limit interface duration and frequency. The certification examination requires 12 consecutive assessments in a 48-hour window. Correct. Nessa stared at the column. So the recommendation is to not do the thing that the certification requires me to do. The certification structure was not designed for your methodology. She stood there for a long time. The chamber was dark except for the column's silver-blue glow and the faint blue of the inactive contact points on 48 empty stations. Eshera's quartz face was visible through the curved viewport, a white crescent against deep black, brilliant and cold, and utterly indifferent to whether she stayed or left. Tesseract, how did the 7 humans who withdrew describe their reason for leaving? 1 second. 3 cited academic underperformance, 2 cited personal circumstances, 1 cited health concerns unspecified, 1 provided no reason. The one who cited health concerns, was it cognitive? Personnel records are confidential. Was it cognitive? 3 seconds. The withdrawal form included the phrase persistent identity confusion. This is the extent of available information. Nessa closed her notebook. She walked back to her quarters and lay in the dark, and listened to the phantom harmonics that were still playing in the back of her skull from the Rithani administrator weeks earlier, layered now with the warlord's clean arithmetic. And she thought about what persistent identity confusion meant for a 17-year-old girl who was very good at being other people, and had not yet learned the price of not knowing when to stop. She didn't withdraw. The 7th assessment cycle was when Thessa started talking to her. Velkari didn't talk the way humans did. They communicated in layered parallel vocal speech carried the surface content, while pupil pattern sequences carried emotional and social subtext simultaneously, a second conversation running alongside the first like a bass line under a melody. A Velkari saying, "Good morning," was simultaneously transmitting an assessment of your current emotional state through nothing, but the sequence in which their four pupils contracted and expanded. Nessa's pupils, when she passed Nessa in the corridor after assessment 14, said something Nessa's conscious mind couldn't decode, but her body responded to like a warm hand on a cold morning. They began eating together in the refectory, not by arrangement. Nessa simply placed her tray across from Nessa's and began eating, which in Velkari social grammar was a formal declaration of association that most non-Velkari would have missed entirely, and Nessa, after 14 assessments of deep immersion cognitive interfacing across 19 species, did not miss. "Your score on the Rithani warlord was exceptional," Nessa said, between bites of a protein supplement that smelled like cold aluminum. I threw up afterward. Two of Nessa's pupils contracted in a pattern Nessa had learned to read as acknowledgement without judgment. The shielding we carry isn't just protection, it's distance. You have no distance. No. That's why your scores are higher than ours. Nessa looked up from her meal. That's not what the Tesseract says. The Tesseract measures methodology. I'm talking about something else. Nessa's four pupils converged, all four, every independent iris focused on a single point like a lens assembly locking to target. You don't read minds, Cadet 31. You visit them. The difference is that a reader goes home at the end of the day. I'm not certain you do. Nessa put her fork down. Is this a warning? It's an observation. Everyone here is very fond of observations. Nessa made a sound, a short, sharp exhalation through her secondary nostrils, that Nessa realized with genuine surprise was laughter. She had never heard a Velkari laugh before. Your species, Nessa said, is either very brave or very young. I haven't decided which. Maybe both. Maybe. They ate the rest of the meal in a silence that felt, for the first time in 9 months, like the comfortable kind. Assessment 15 was the last before the certification window opened, and it carried a weight the others hadn't. A compound live assessment, 2 subjects simultaneously, the same configuration that would appear in the certification exam's hardest tiers. A Pelori trade minister and a Korvathi colonial attaché, both conscious, both defended, their minds linked through the Institute's relay as they negotiated a territorial clause in real time. The assessment task was straightforward. Identify each party's true priority and predict which would concede first. Nessa fell into both minds at once. The Pelori's architecture was fluid, shifting, decision nodes forming and dissolving as the negotiation moved, her cognitive framework adapting to each counteroffer the way water adapts to the shape of its container. The Korvatha's was rigid, segmented, 4 parallel tracks each evaluating a different dimension of the proposal, converging at junctions where the majority track prevailed. For the first time, Nessa experienced 2 living minds simultaneously, and the collision was unlike anything the archival compounds had prepared her for. Living minds responded to each other. The Pelori's fluidity was partly a reaction to the Korvatha's rigidity, and the Korvatha's certainty was partly a mask over the anxiety that the Pelori's adaptability was generating in his threat assessment subroutines. They were shaping each other in real time, and Nessa was inside both of them, feeling the shaping from both directions, holding 2 sets of cognitive weather in her unshielded awareness while her brain's instinct was to synthesize them into one. She came out 60 seconds later with sweat on her forehead and a complete analysis that included not just both parties' priorities but the dynamic between them. The way each mind was modifying the other's architecture through the act of negotiation itself. She identified that the Korvathi would concede first, not because his position was weaker, but because his rigid processing would eventually flag the Pelori's adaptability as an unresolvable variable and optimize by yielding the least costly clause. She identified that the Pelori knew this and was deliberately increasing her fluidity to accelerate the Korvatha's concession timeline. She scored 92, The Tesseract flagged her dynamic interaction analysis for institutional review. The headache after that session lasted 6 hours. She lost 20 minutes of memory from the morning, a gap she discovered when her notebook entry for breakfast didn't match her recollection. She wrote that night, 2 minds at once. Felt them change each other. Felt myself change with them. Cost, memory loss 20 min, headache 6 HR. Residual. The Corvatha's rigidity feels comforting in a way that should worry me. She underlined the last phrase twice. The night before the certification window opened, she sat in the refectory with Nessa for what might have been the last time. If Nessa failed, or withdrew, she would be on a transport back to Earth within 48 hours, and the refectory table where they'd shared 6 months of meals would be occupied by the next cohort's version of someone eating alone. Nessa ate in silence for most of the meal, her 4 pupils cycling through patterns Nessa could read now. Concern assessment, a particular Velkari combination that translated roughly as I have information I am choosing not to share because sharing it would constitute interference. Finally, near the end, Nessa looked up. I spoke with the previous cohort's top-ranked Velkari graduate, Nessa said. She works in diplomatic cognitive analysis for the Velkari Continuity Council now. She told me something about the certification examination that I think you should hear. Go ahead. She said that the final live assessment is selected to match the candidate's greatest vulnerability. For shielded species, this typically means a subject whose cognitive architecture exploits gaps in the shield's frequency response. A mind that operates in a range the shield wasn't calibrated for. For you, Nessa paused. All 4 pupils held still, which was the Velkari equivalent of taking a deep breath before speaking. For you, she said the vulnerability they will test is not cognitive bandwidth. It is the question of whether you can come back. Come back from what? From wherever you go when you're inside someone else. Nessa looked at Nessa. After 9 months, she could read the Velkari's pupil patterns with a fluency that would have been impossible on day 1, and that was itself evidence of the cost she was paying. She had learned to read Velkari nonverbal communication not through study, but through residual patterning from the Velkari cognitive architectures she'd inhabited during assessments. The knowledge was hers now, but the origin wasn't, and the distinction between the two was getting harder to find. I'll come back, Nessa said. Nessa's pupils shifted into the pattern that meant I hope you're right, and I am not able to verify this, and the uncertainty costs me something. It was a complex pattern. Most Velkari reserved it for family. I'll be in the corridor when you come out, Nessa said. Regardless of the result. I know. The certification examination was 72 hours long. 12 consecutive assessments, 2 live subjects, 10 archival, increasing complexity, no breaks longer than 30 minutes between sessions, passing threshold, cumulative average of 70 across all 12 with no individual assessment below 55. Unrestricted certification required a cumulative average of 85 with no individual score below 70. Nessa walked into the examination chamber on a Tuesday morning, carrying nothing visible and everything invisible. 9 months of other people's, whether systems settled into the folds of her unshielded brain like sediment in a slow river. She had slept 4 hours, eaten a meal she would not remember, and brought the notebook in the pocket of her jumpsuit. 63 handwritten pages from 9 months of inhabiting other minds. The last entry, written the previous night in steady handwriting, read, "The cost is real. The math doesn't change. Go anyway." The first 4 assessments were archival. A Corvathi trade negotiator whose mind converted information into leverage with mechanical precision. A Pelori colony planner whose spatial cognition mapped resource distribution across a continent with the 3-dimensional clarity of a cartographer drawing rivers in the air. A Dacic military theorist whose silence architecture was so dense that the cognitive load felt like swimming through deep water, every thought hidden in the negative space between other thoughts. A Velkari grief counselor whose emotional architecture was the most intricate structure Nessa had encountered, grief organized not as absence but as presence, a room where the dead still lived in the pattern of the space around them. Scores 88, 82, 86, and 91. The headache settled during the second assessment and stayed like a tenant who knew it wasn't leaving. Assessment 5 was the first live subject. A Torvani engineer who had volunteered for the program and sat in a separate chamber, linked through the Institute's relay network. His mind opened, methodical, dense, the cognitive equivalent of a well-organized workshop where every tool had its designated hook. Nessa spent 44 seconds inside it. She identified his primary engineering methodology, his stress responses under equipment failure, his decision heuristics when materials ran short, and the specific emotional threshold that would cause him to abandon a failing project rather than waste resources on a losing proposition. She scored 90. Assessments 6 through 9 blurred in the way that sustained effort always blurs when the body is running on something deeper than energy. A Rithani physician whose compassion architecture was threaded through, with exhaustion so deep it had become structural. The exhaustion wasn't a flaw, it was load-bearing, a wall holding the rest of the architecture upright. A Korvathi colonial administrator whose decision trees were pristine and empty of doubt, each branch terminating in the certainty that the optimal choice had been made because the algorithm had been followed, and the algorithm was correct. A Pelori emergency coordinator whose mind under crisis resembled a switchboard running at full capacity. Every circuit engaged, no spare bandwidth, the cognitive equivalent of someone shouting calmly while the room around them burned. An Adasic philosopher whose mind was the most beautiful structure Nessa had ever inhabited, vast, quiet, organized around absences, the way cathedrals are organized around the space between pillars. And she came back from it with tears on her face and a score of 93 and couldn't explain to anyone, including herself, why both of those things were happening simultaneously. The headache was constant now, not sharp, deep like pressure behind a dam that had been holding for 9 months and knew it could hold longer but not forever. Her notebook entries between sessions grew shorter and more clinical. Assessment 6, 87, Physician, Complex Grief Architecture, Residual Compassion Fatigue Est, 2 HR. Assessment 7, 85, Administrator, Clean, Minimal Residual. Assessment 8, 89, Emergency Coordinator, Residual Elevated Heart Rate, Phantom Alarm Sounds in Peripheral Hearing. Assessment 9, 93, Philosopher, Residual Beauty, Duration, Unknown. Assessment 10 was when the cost came due. The subject was archival, a human. Specifically, a Terran colonial governor who had managed a mining settlement on a moon whose atmospheric processors were failing. The governor's decision architecture covered 96 hours of crisis management, rationing, triage protocols, communication with a relief fleet that was 72 hours away, and the final decision to seal the settlement's secondary dome, knowing it contained 41 people who could not be evacuated in time, to preserve atmospheric integrity in the primary dome for the remaining 400. Nessa fell in, and the governor's mind fit hers like a key in a lock she hadn't known existed. Not because they were similar as people, because the governor's decision architecture was built on a foundation Nessa recognized with the bone-deep familiarity of her own heartbeat, the terrible clarity of a person who has accepted that the math requires an answer they can't live with and has given the answer anyway. The same foundation she'd felt in the Rithani warlord, but the warlord's version was clean, optimized, without cost. The governor's version was saturated in it. Every decision node in the architecture was wrapped in grief that the governor hadn't stopped to feel, because stopping would have killed the 400. The numbers were the same kind of numbers. The weight was completely different. She lived inside that mind for 60 seconds. She felt the governor seal the dome. She felt the governor not seal her own grief. It was there, in every subsequent decision, a permanent tremor in the architecture that the governor compensated for the way you compensate for a limp, automatically, constantly, at a cost invisible to everyone except the person paying it. She came out and couldn't remember her own name for 11 seconds. She knew it was 11 seconds because the Tesseract told her afterward. Cadet 31, you experienced an identity loss event of 11 seconds duration during Assessment 10. This has been logged. Do you wish to continue the examination? Nessa was sitting in the station. Her hands were flat on the armrests. She could feel them, her hands, hers, the callus on her right index finger from the notebook pen, the small scar on her left thumb from a kitchen accident at age 12, the slightly different temperature between left and right, because the left armrest sat closer to the climate vent. She inventoried these details one by one, the way a pilot inventories instruments after a power failure, confirming each reading before moving to the next. What's my current cumulative average? 88.7. What do I need on the last 2 assessments to maintain unrestricted threshold? A minimum of 70 on each individual assessment. Your cumulative can absorb scores as low as 62 on each remaining assessment and still meet the 85 threshold. Then I continue. The identity loss event suggests increasing cognitive load. The advisory recommendation. I continue. 2 seconds of silence. Acknowledged. Assessment 11 was a Corvathi Fleet Admiral, hard, dense, multi-layered. A mind organized like a precision instrument designed by someone who believed efficiency was a moral value. Nessa processed it with the grim competence of someone who has stopped being impressed by difficulty and started treating it as terrain to be crossed, one handhold at a time. She scored 84. She wrote nothing in the notebook between sessions. The headache was no longer a discrete sensation. It had become a weather system, a permanent overcast behind her eyes that she walked through the way you walk through fog. Assessment 12, the final, was a live subject. Nessa had not been told who the subject would be. The Institute selected the final examination subject based on the individual candidate's performance trajectory, choosing a cognitive profile that would test the specific area where the methodology was most likely to fail under pressure. The contacts engaged, and Nessa recognized the mind immediately, not the individual, the architecture. It was a Rithani colonial administrator, the cognitive pattern structurally similar to the crisis manager from Assessment 6. The same harmonic resonance structure, the same decision layering, the same emotional register of a person who managed populations and understood that every resource allocation was, at some level, a decision about who mattered more. But this was live. The administrator was in the relay chamber, conscious, aware of being observed, and her mind's defenses were active. The harmonics shifted. The resonance patterns modulated in real time. The architecture rearranged itself as Nessa watched, the way a person shifts posture and crosses their arms when they realize they're being studied. Nessa felt the defenses and understood them, not analytically, not as patterns to be mapped, but the way you understand someone crossing their arms. She didn't push against them. She didn't probe. She settled into the architecture the way you sit down in someone's living room, gently, with the unspoken assurance that you're not there to take anything, only to understand. And the administrator, sensing the absence of pressure, did something no assessment subject had done in any of Nessa's previous sessions. She relaxed. The defenses softened. The harmonics opened. And Nessa saw in the architecture's unguarded deep structure the thing the assessment was designed to test, the administrator's deepest resource allocation principle. Not the official one in her policy documentation, not the one she'd present to a review board. The real one, the one that lived in the substrate, below conscious access, shaped by 40 years of decisions and their accumulated weight. The principle was this: protect the ones who cannot protect themselves, even when the math says otherwise. Nessa came out of the interface. She was crying, tears running down her face while her hands wrote the assessment with steady precision, because the two things had nothing to do with each other. The tears were residual, someone else's emotional weather passing through her unshielded mind the way sunlight passes through glass. The assessment was hers, precise, complete, grounded in 9 months of learning the hard difference between analyzing a mind and understanding a person. She scored 97. The examination chamber held its silence. The tesseract's holographic column sustained its brightened state. In the observation gallery above, behind the curved window, shapes moved, members of the certification board, reviewing the results in real time, their silhouettes shifting with the particular restlessness of people confronting data they hadn't expected and weren't sure how to file. Nessa sat in the station and waited. The headache pulsed behind her eyes. The phantom harmonics played their layered music in the back of her awareness. The ghost of the Dacic philosopher's cathedral mind still echoed somewhere inside her, and beneath it, fainter but persistent, the Terran governor's grief hummed like a bass note that would never fully resolve. The Tesseract spoke. Cadet 31. Your cumulative assessment average across 12 examinations is 88.8. No individual assessment fell below 82. You have met the criteria for unrestricted cognitive analyst certification. She said nothing. This is the first unrestricted certification achieved by a Terran candidate in the Keris Analytical Institute's 90-year operational history. She stood, her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were red and her head ached, and somewhere inside her cognitive architecture, there were pieces of 19 different minds settled like sediment in a riverbed, and she would carry them for the rest of her life. And she knew this now in a way she hadn't known it 9 months ago when she'd sat down in a station, because a Velkari told her not to, and the knowing was the distance between naivety and wisdom. And the difference was that wisdom cost something, and you paid it with your eyes open and your hands steady, and your name still your own. Cadet 31. She turned. The methodology you employed across these assessments does not match any recognized framework in the Institute's pedagogical library. The Certification Board has requested a formal designation for the purpose of institutional records. Nessa looked at the column. She thought of the 3-line advisory sheet still folded in her pocket. She thought of the Velkari's warning on day 1 and the Velkari's laughter in the refectory 9 months later. She thought of Thessa saying you visit them and the question that followed it. Does the reader go home at the end? Call it what it is, she said. Empathic integration. The Tesseract processed this for 1 full second. Noted. The designation will be entered into the certification record. She walked out of the chamber. Thessa was in the corridor, leaning against the far wall with her arms crossed and all 4 pupils tracking Nessa's face with the converged focus that meant, in Velkari, the thing closest to what humans would call concern. You look terrible, Thessa said. I feel terrible. You passed. I know. Unrestricted. Yes. Thessa's 4 pupils held their convergence for a beat, then separated into a pattern Nessa recognized now, after 9 months, as warmth, genuine, unguarded, the Velkari version of a smile that a human would never have noticed on day 1 but that Nessa, after everything she had inhabited and everything it had cost, read as clearly as printed text. Your species, Thessa said, is definitely both. Nessa almost smiled, almost. Instead, she leaned against the opposite wall and closed her eyes and let the headache be what it was, and the harmonics play what they played, and the ghost weather of 19 different minds move through her unshielded awareness like clouds through a sky that had never learned to be anything but open. She was 17. She was very, very good at being other people. And she had learned in the space of 9 months and 12 final assessments and 1 identity loss event of 11 seconds duration that the cost of understanding was carrying what you understood, and that wisdom wasn't knowing the price in advance, but paying it with your eyes open and your hands steady, and your name still yours at the end. The notebook was in her pocket. The last page was still blank. She would fill it later. Right now, she stood in the bright corridor of the Keris Analytical Institute, certified and tired and changed, and carrying the weather of every mind she'd ever visited. And the white light of Eshera's quartz face fell through the viewport and landed on her hands, and she looked at them, her hands, hers, still hers, and that was enough.